It began quietly. No press conference, no fiery speech, no grand announcement. Just a sudden memo circulating through Washington, and within hours, headlines exploded. The United States had lifted the tariffs on steel and aluminum, the very tariffs that had defined years of economic warfare, trade tension, and political debate. For years, these tariffs were the symbol of America's trade defiance, a wall of protection around domestic industry, a weapon against foreign competition, and a statement of economic nationalism. But tonight, that wall has fallen. The words "steel and aluminum tariffs gone" spread across news tickers like wildfire. And in corporate boardrooms across the country, the reaction was immediate. Celebration. CEOs, economists, and industry leaders hailed the move as a massive win, not just for business but for the entire U.S. economy. Many described it as the long-awaited breath of fresh air after years of suffocating. Trade policies that had restricted growth and innovation. To understand the scale of this moment, we have to look back. 2018, tariffs on steel and aluminum became the centerpiece of former President Donald Trump's trade policy. They were introduced with a simple but powerful idea: to protect American jobs and force foreign competitors to play fair. Steel from China, aluminum from Canada, and imports from Europe were taxed heavily, sometimes up to 25%. The logic was clear: make imported materials more expensive so American manufacturers could thrive. It was a move designed to rebuild the American steel industry and send a message to the world that the U.S. would no longer be taken advantage of in trade. But over the years, reality told a different story. These tariffs didn't just hit foreign exporters. They hit American manufacturers too. Automotive plants in Detroit, appliance factories in Tennessee, and construction firms in Texas all suddenly found themselves paying higher prices for the very metals they needed to build cars, refrigerators, and skyscrapers. Many businesses had no choice but to raise prices, delay projects, or even lay off workers. Steel mills that were supposed to revive saw temporary gains, but the rest of the economy absorbed the cost. As one economist famously put it, tariffs protect a few but tax everyone. By 2024, global trade was changing fast. Supply chains had become more interconnected than ever. American companies no longer just competed globally, they operated globally. Every car, every plane, every smartphone was made from materials that crossed borders multiple times before reaching the final product. And those tariffs, once seen as a shield, had become shackles. They had turned into a burden that slowed innovation and reduced America's ability to stay competitive in global markets. Inside the White House, discussions began to shift. Economic advisors started presenting alarming data. U.S. manufacturers were losing their competitive edge. Costs were climbing, innovation was slowing, and global partners were retaliating with their own tariffs. For industries like aerospace, electronics, and renewable energy, the cost of steel and aluminum was a bottleneck. American factories couldn't expand. New infrastructure projects faced delays. Consumer prices crept up and inflationary pressures mounted. Behind closed doors, meetings stretched into late nights. The Council of Economic Advisors produced a detailed report, one that painted a stark picture. If tariffs stayed in place, the U.S. risked losing not just profits, but long-term industrial competitiveness. The report warned that the manufacturing sector could not sustain itself without reliable access to affordable imported materials. That's when the plan quietly began to shift. Instead of doubling down on protectionism, the administration would pivot. The memo that reached key agencies was short but decisive. Effective immediately, tariffs on imported steel and aluminum would be lifted. There was no televised address, no campaign rally announcement, just an abrupt change in federal policy. But within minutes, markets reacted. Steel and aluminum stocks surged. Automotive companies, construction firms, and heavy manufacturers saw their share prices jump overnight. On Wall Street, optimism replaced uncertainty, and across the industrial heartland, CEOs called emergency meetings, but for once not in panic but in celebration. One manufacturing executive told reporters, "This is the relief we've been waiting for. We can finally build without the weight of tariffs crushing our margins." The decision sparked a wave of confidence across the corporate world. In cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, plant managers began recalculating production costs. In Houston, construction companies reopened bids that had been on hold for months. In Silicon Valley, technology firms predicted faster production of consumer electronics as supply chains became more fluid again. Economists called it the biggest economic reset in a decade. But the story isn't just about markets or policy, it's about perception. For years, tariffs had been politically untouchable. They symbolized strength, independence, and national pride. Rolling them back risked alienating a core base of supporters, especially in regions that had believed tariffs were the last defense against globalization. Yet despite the political risks, the administration framed the decision as an act of strategy, not surrender. Officials described it as a smart pivot for a changing economy. Even Trump himself in private discussions was quoted as saying, "You can't fight the world forever. At some point you've got to trade smart." As the news spread globally, reactions poured in. In Europe, trade ministers called it a positive reset. In Canada, government spokespeople welcomed the move as a return to economic cooperation. And in Asia, particularly China, the mood was cautious but optimistic, an opening for renewed trade talks after years of tension. The lifting of tariffs immediately reduced friction in international negotiations that had stalled for years. For corporate America, however, this was more than diplomacy. It was survival. Steel and aluminum are the backbone of countless industries. Automobiles and trucks, skyscrapers and bridges, electronics, appliances, aircraft and energy systems. For years, companies had been forced to cut corners, delay projects, or pass costs to consumers. Now, with tariffs gone, the weight was finally lifting. One CEO called it the biggest boost to U.S. competitiveness in a decade. Another said, "We can finally plan ahead, not around tariffs, but around innovation." The relief was visible across sectors, from heavy industry to high-tech manufacturing. Even small businesses, which had quietly suffered from rising costs of materials, expressed hope that they could finally stabilize prices and keep up with demand. The real-world effects began almost immediately. Orders for imported steel and aluminum shot up. Factories restarted idle production lines. Construction companies renegotiated contracts that had stalled for months. Consumer goods, too, felt the ripple. Appliances, cars, and even infrastructure projects saw price relief. For an economy still navigating post-pandemic inflation and supply chain recovery, this policy shift couldn't have come at a better time. Still, critics weren't silent. Some accused the administration of inconsistency, of reversing years of rhetoric that painted tariffs as patriotic. Others argued that lifting them would invite cheap imports, threatening American jobs again. Economists countered that reality had already spoken. High tariffs hadn't saved those jobs. They'd only moved the pain elsewhere. Studies by independent think tanks showed that while tariffs protected a few domestic producers, they increased costs for millions of downstream businesses. Every car manufacturer, every construction company, every tech firm paid the price. And in an interconnected global economy, protectionism had become too costly to maintain. One study even estimated that the steel and aluminum tariffs alone had cost the U.S. economy over 75,000 jobs in industries reliant on metal imports. So what happens now? Experts say this could mark the beginning of a new trade era, one based not on walls, but on balance. The U.S. is expected to pair tariff relief with targeted domestic incentives, investing in clean manufacturing, renewable materials, and high-tech industries. In other words, build at home but trade smart abroad. Economists predict that this hybrid approach could spark innovation, attract foreign investment, and make U.S. industries more resilient against future shocks. The lifting of steel and aluminum tariffs isn't just a change in policy. It's a signal that America has recognized the limits of isolation, that strength isn't about shutting doors, but knowing when to open them strategically. The move aligns the U.S. with global trends, where collaboration, not confrontation, defines progress. Analysts believe that this shift could even strengthen America's influence in global trade organizations and restore confidence among allies who had grown wary of its protectionist stance. For business leaders, the message is clear. Trade wars create uncertainty. Trade balance creates opportunity. And for millions of American workers, this shift could mean something tangible: cheaper materials, stable jobs, and renewed industrial momentum. Some analysts have compared this moment to the trade liberalizations of the 1990s, when opening markets led to rapid innovation and economic growth. The lifting of tariffs also highlights a deeper truth about leadership and adaptation. Policies once seen as unshakable symbols of power can quickly become obsolete in a world that moves faster than politics.